Palestinian Authority's prime minister, the Hamas figure, has endorsed the attack on and the capture of the Israeli soldier, Shalit, by Hamas. It's the most absurd notion that there's a military wing of Hamas that operates independently from Hamas proper. That's just ridiculous. Hamas is Hamas, and it and Hezbollah get a lot of funding from and take their orders to a great extent from Tehran. I think that the likelihood of a disengagement of the sort that was being contemplated early in the summer of 2006 and before by Prime Minister Omer is very unlikely. I really believe that, in part because of the terrible education system that has been visited on Palestinian children by Wahhabi, Saudi-funded hate materials, teaching these little kids to become suicide bombers when they're 8 years old. I think because of Iranian influence with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the various parts of Fatah as well, that the Israeli-Palestinian situation may be one of the last things settled in the Middle East, not one of the first. People have just been altogether too optimistic, I think, that the Palestinians can move beyond the education that's foisted on their kids, the horrible conditions in which they're kept by Arab governments. Whenever Israel would try to build nicer apartment buildings and so forth for the Palestinians in the camps, the nearby Arab governments would oppose. Only Jordan has permitted Palestinians in the camps to have Jordanian citizenship. Lebanon never has, Syria never has, Egypt never has. And we have this completely absurd, wholly separate notion of the way the Palestinian refugees who came out of 1948 bordered Israel at the time of the Israeli War of Independence in 48 should be treated compared with other refugees. Europe had millions of people who moved because borders changed during and after World War II. And not only are they not, let's say, Sudeten Germans who moved out of Czechoslovakia, not only are they not regarded as candidates, if they were alive then, now they're in their 60s or older, to move back into Czechoslovakia, but certainly their children and grandchildren are not. Yet that's the way the United Nations organization that deals with the Palestinians is set up under this set of assumptions. Nobody is trying to make it possible financially and otherwise for the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were expelled or who left places like Lebanon in 1948 to go back and be compensated to go back into Lebanon. The whole structure of the way the Palestinian refugees have been treated by the United Nations and by the surrounding Arab states is basically nuts. There's nothing like it in international law. And especially it's nuts because the West Bank, for example, the last time it was part of a real state, it was the Ottoman Empire. It has been either in uncertain status as part of the Palestinian Mandate operated by Britain or in an intermediate status with being administered by Jordan for a time and then not. It's not as if there were a Palestinian state there that Israel had conquered in an aggressive war. Israel's wars have all been defensive anyway. They keep having to fight because they get attacked by, it's what happened, except for Suez. It's what happened in 48, it's what happened in 67, it's what happened in 73. And each time they were attacked, they won and ended up, particularly after the '67 war, with some increased territory that they occupied. Probably would have been wise for them after '67 to adopt the plan of the late and wonderful Yigal Allon, who thought that what should happen was that about 3/4 of the West Bank should be attached to Jordan and become part of Jordan, and Israel should hold on to some portions of it after the '67 war. But he couldn't get acceptance of that within the Israeli political system, and it's a shame. It probably would have resolved a lot of the current difficulties. Well, part of the problem is that whenever a leader in that part of the world has courageously done what is right, like Anwar Sadat, he is at serious risk, and in Sadat's case was in fact murdered. It's sort of the same answer as saying, where are the moderate Muslims on the Sunni side when the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia issue these hideous fatwas and statements? The answer is there are a good number of decent, reasonable Muslims who want to just worship and live their lives with their families and have decent lives, and are not fanatics, not terrorists. But when one of their imams, one of the imams from, say, the Sufi tradition, or one of the moderate jurisprudential schools like the Hanafis, speaks up and says from a mosque in Cairo or a publication in Beirut that we really have to work with the Christians and Jews, we have to all live together, we're all children of Abraham, we need to go at this sensibly. Within days, you'll have several fatwas come out from radical clerics, several in Saudi Arabia usually, and one or two elsewhere, saying this man is an apostate and must be killed. So part of what we've got here, in a way, is a civil war within Islam in which the real hardliners, like the Wahhabis, not only have custody of the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, but they're fantastically rich. The Saudi government gives to the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia something on the order of $3 or $4 billion a year, and they probably get another billion or two from wealthy individuals and so-called charities in the Middle East. At the peak of their power and influence in the 1970s, the KGB didn't have more than about $1 billion a year to spend on what they called active measures abroad, things like propaganda and so forth. The Wahhabis have several times that. And what they teach is essentially the same as what Al-Qaeda teaches. The only difference between the Wahhabis and Al-Qaeda is they disagree about who should be in charge. But their underlying doctrine is quite literally genocidal with respect to Shiite Muslims, Jews, homosexuals, and apostates. And it's incredibly repressive of everyone else, terribly repressive of women, of course, completely hostile to democracy, and so on. The Wahhabis believe that set of views, and those who espouse it should work at the service of the Saudi state. Al-Qaeda believes they should be free to fly aircraft into buildings whenever and wherever they want, and in that regard, these two groups are a little bit like the Stalinists and the Trotskyites in the 1920s and 1930s. They both had the underlying view that the world should be communist and under a dictatorship. They just disagreed about the tactics of getting there and who should be in charge. Didn't mean they didn't hate one another. Trotsky died with a Stalinist axe in his skull in 1940 in Mexico. And the Wahhabis and Al-Qaeda hate each other. But they don't hate each other about their underlying views. They hate each other because they're rivals about who should be in charge. There are a couple of aspects, I think, to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There are, I'm sure, non-fanatic Palestinians who have their differences with Israel, but would be willing to work something out. And there is some conflict there. who gets what part of East Jerusalem? Which Israeli settlements get to stay inside Israel proper if there's a state, and the Palestinian state in the West Bank? But with those Palestinians, Israel could come to agreement. And there were a few of them, I think, in Arafat's delegation in early 2001 at the end of the Clinton administration when he turned down Barak's offer for a settlement. But the really hard part of the confrontation is that groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and certainly parts of Fatah, and certainly now, in the aftermath of the turnover of Gaza, the Iranian Republican Revolutionary Guard troops and the Pasdaran and the Al-Qaeda and the others who are in Gaza, their objective is not to have a two-state solution with somewhat different borders than Israel wants. When they talk about occupied Palestine, they mean Tel Aviv. They want to destroy the Jewish state. Ahmadinejad is explicit about it in Iran. It is explicit in Hamas's charter. It is explicit every way one can think of in what Hezbollah says and does. And it's explicit in the doctrine, essentially, of the Syrian state. So when one is trying to deal with someone who wants, first and foremost, to kill you and make sure that your state doesn't exist at all, it's rather difficult to get down to the business of haggling about just exactly where the barrier should go, or just exactly which Israeli settlements ought to be inside and which ones ought to be not inside. One thing that I think it's important to realize is that the democratic steps in Iraq may, knock on wood, may continue, and so Iraq may be another state. But for the time being, there's only one state in the Middle East which is a real democracy and where hundreds of thousands of Arabs go to the polls, vote for real representatives in a real legislature, worship the way they want, whatever part of Islam they come from, can operate newspapers freely, utilize freedom of speech, and that country is Israel. Because about 1/6 of the Israeli population are Israeli Arabs. They are the envy, privately, they are told, the envy of most other Arabs in the Middle East who live under terrible governments. If the Palestinians someday, this group of, I hope numerous, at some point, decent, reasonable Palestinians, can somehow purge themselves of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, then at least one can dream about a day in which, if Jews were settled in the West Bank in a Palestinian state, they would be treated the same way, with the same fairness and decency that Israel treats its Arab citizens. Now, for now, it would be foolhardy for an Israeli Jew to try to live in the West Bank in a Palestinian state. He'd be killed immediately. Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful phrase. He said, "You never want to define deviancy down. You don't want to say that because your skin is this color or you're this religion or whatever, I'm going to expect less of you. You don't have it in you to be a really decent human being because you're an X. So we're going to lower our expectations for you." In some ways, that's the worst thing you can do to a people. And what much of the world has now done to the Palestinians is they've defined deviancy down. They've implicitly said, we don't expect Palestinians to be able to run a state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem in such a way as to treat Jews who settle there decently. And keep in mind, 1/6 of the Israeli population are Arabs. If 1/6 of the population of the West Bank and Gaza were Jews, there'd be about twice as many Jewish settlers in the West Bank as there are now. It'd be about 500,000 instead of about 250,000. So someday, someday, I would have some hope that we might have the same expectations, everybody might have the same expectations for the Palestinians with respect to democracy and the rule of law and decent treatment of minorities that we hold Israel to. And under those circumstances, a two-state solution in which there's some Arabs, Muslims living in Israel and some Jews, maybe Israeli citizens, expatriates living in the West Bank because they want to live in Hebron, because Hebron, tombs of the patriarchs and so forth, that ought to be fine. In a reasonable world, that ought to be fine. It's, I'm afraid, a long way off. Well, it's not impossible for cultures to change. It's hard to make them change fast. Probably one of the faster sets of changes in modern history was the evolution that Japan and Germany went through in the aftermath of World War II, in the presence of American, and in the case of Germany, Allied occupation. And they stopped teaching kids the fanaticism that the Japanese Empire was teaching them. They stopped teaching the Hitler Youth, of course, and but it took a generation or so. And keep in mind, the Israelites were kept in the desert for 40 years because the Lord wanted to make sure they changed their attitudes, and it took a couple of generations, at least at that point. So this is not quick. If in some fashion a democratic movement took root in Saudi Arabia with all its oil wealth, and the Wahhabis were effectively disestablished, and all of that money started to be used for decent education systems instead of what these Palestinian kids are getting. Could one see fundamental changes in 10, 20, 30 years? Sure, I think so. But under the likely course of events in the Middle East, barring some fundamental change of that hypothetical sort, the hatred that the Wahhabis fund, and which is propagated by both on the Sunni and on the Shiite side, funded by Iran, that hatred is poisoning the minds of little children, and they are being taught at virtually first, second grade levels to be terrorists, and that is the essence of what God wants them to do, what their families want them to do, what their culture and civilization and religion want them to do. And this is going to take a long time to work through. The best one can hope for, I think, is a few decades rather than many, many decades. I was at a conference in Israel a few years ago, right after I stepped down from a government job, and an old Israeli man asked me just before I got up to talk, he said, "You have a reputation for working with us. Why?" He said, "We're not always easy to get along with." And I thought about it a little bit, and hearkening back to my Presbyterian Sunday school, when I stood up, I said, Mr. Rubenstein had asked me this question, and I thought about it a little bit, and I said, I decided it's because of Naboth's vineyard. And quite a few Israelis knew about Naboth's vineyard, and if one remembers the story, it's in the northern kingdom, and Naboth has a vineyard, and Ahab is the king, and his queen Jezebel decides that the king ought to have the vineyard, so she bribes some men to bear false witness against Naboth. He's stoned to death, and the vineyard escheats to the king, and Ahab's very happy at first until he is challenged and told by the greatest of the prophets that here in one action you violated 2 of the 10. You murdered and then stole. And what does Naboth do? He covers himself. He doesn't, what does Ahab do? He doesn't do what most 8th century BC kings would do. He covers himself in sackcloth and ashes and goes around and terribly sad and repents. And in the Bible, the Lord lets the northern kingdom have, I think, another couple of generations, even though it's been a pretty bad place. Well, what's interesting about that is that as far back as then, and really going all the way back to the Exodus, the key concept here is that the law is above the king. And that was new in the Sinai Desert a millennium and a half or so before Christ. And it's still probably the principal basis on which other reforms can take place. Democracy without the law being above the king, without the rule of law, is basically a mob, and capitalism without that is theft, essentially. So even the reforms of Greece and Rome, democracy and the notion of checks and balances and so forth, none of those matter unless the law means something more than just its people's temporary choice. We, Christians, others in the world, really have the Jews to thank for that. That's where that comes from. And as far as I'm concerned, everything else derives from it.